So as I said, Darwin's theory occur in four major steps, and we are going to look at them one after the other, starting with overproduction. So each species produce more offspring that can survive. So each species of living organisms produce more offspring that can survive. So generally, that is why if you can see that naturally most of the living organisms when they are giving birth to their young ones, you will see that they give birth to a so many number of offspring. They will produce so many number of offspring, and that is actually to increase the chances of the survival and sustainability of that species of living organisms. And I want us to understand that generally in the world population now, if you want to actually maintain the species of a particular living organism, so generally the number of natality must always be greater than the number of mortality. Because if the number of living organisms that are dying is greater than the number of living organisms that are giving out is greater than the number of living organisms that are produced. So it means that there is a likelihood that that species of living organisms may be eliminated. And I want you to understand, ladies and gentlemen, because during our previous classes we talked about extinction. Extinction, that is complete elimination of living organisms, and we have endangered. That is those organisms that are actually moving toward the direction of elimination. So generally, for a particular species of a living organisms to remain on Earth, the number of offspring produced, or each species must produce more offspring that can survive, so that at least you will maintain, or the species of that living organisms will survive or will be maintained on Earth. And if things like this is not happening, maybe 10 people die to produce, that is actually an attainment and an attainment of extinction, which is actually endangered species. So that is overproduction. And second, variation. So each individual has a unique combination of inherited traits. So adaptation and inherited traits that increases an organism's chances of surviving. So what does that mean? So when we said variation, it means is the differences that exist between individuals of the same species based on the inherited traits. What does that mean? We have what we call inherited traits, and it's of course what makes us unique from one another. Some of you actually came from Lagos, some of you from Kaduna, some of you from maybe Abuja, and you now came to Zaria. So, and at the same time, we may have variation. What is that variation? You can see someone in Zaria may actually vary from someone in Lagos because of the environment and the types of food that they are taking. Like for example, if I now travel to, I'm Nigerian, so assuming now I now travel to country like Moscow where there is ice, it will be very, very difficult for me to survive that environment, because the inherited traits of me is different from the inherited trait of those that are surviving from Moscow. So variation is the differences that exist between individuals of the same species based on their combination of inherited traits. The reason is because I do not develop a gene. I doesn't have a gene that will produce a functional protein that will allow me to adapt the ice in Moscow. But those that are surviving there because their parents survived there, their grandparents are also there, so they have actually inherited such kind of genes that will allow them to survive in that environment. But for me to survive in that particular environment, it will be very difficult. But my ability to be able to to survive in that particular environment is what you call adaptation. But we are varied. There is that variation between us. So an inherited trait that increases an organism chances of survival is what you call adaptation. So an inherited trait, a trait that I inherited from my parent that will increase my chances to survive in a particular environment is what you call adaptation. So adaptation is the ability of living organisms to, based on the traits inherited from his parent, increase the chances of that organisms to survive. So that is variation. So the next thing is, why is variation important? Why variation is important? Because the environment changes. So because environment are changing, so there is a need to have a variation. So more variation within a species, the more likely it will survive. So it means that if you are now a particular living organisms, and the more the variation within a species, the more the variation within a species, that is the more the differences within a species, it means that the more likelihoods or the more likely it will survive. Example, if everyone is the same, they are all vulnerable to the same environmental changes or disease. Like, for example, let's now take the issue of coronavirus. When the coronavirus came, you will see that the effect of coronavirus in Nigeria is very less compared to deaths from other Western world. And this is because the vulnerability of the disease in Nigeria is very low. It's very small. And that is why we should understand variation is very important. So because the kind of human species we are in Nigeria and the environment we are surviving, that what actually protect us from the consequences posed by the coronavirus. So that is why this variation is very, very important. Because let me just give you an example of this variation in terms of actually immunity. Our immunity in Nigeria is very strong because we are surviving in dust. You can't compare the immunity of someone from let's say here in Nigeria, or let me say here from Zaria, and someone that is surviving in Villa, Abuja, because there is likelihood that there may not be mosquito there, even if there is, but maybe they are using insecticides and the types of food that are taken. And so we that are surviving in dust, like for example, you are in Zaria, or maybe you are from one village like that, there are many flies everywhere. There is a lot of animal dungs. There are so many things there, and they are biting you. So as a result of that, your immunity is increasing. So as such, of course, we have a high chances of surviving when it comes to issue of this infectious disease, because our immunity is very strong, and this is because of the variation. So we are not the same. We are not the same. So if everyone is the same, it means that when there is any kinds of disease that came into a particular environment, we would all die. So the variation is the inherited traits that varies across individuals. And that is why we can't die all at the same time. Unless if it is actually the resurrection day. That is Al-Qiyamah. And that is the only time that we'll all die. But we will die differently because we have different different things exist in us. We have different things, different inherited traits. And that is why some will adapt to these particular challenges and some will not adapt, so they will die. So those that will survive as a result of the variations that they have is the fittest organisms. And that is what you call survival of the fittest. So those organisms that fit the environment will survive, and those that didn't, that unfit the environment will die. So it's because of this variation, because some organisms, as a result of that variation, they have a trait that will make them to adapt to a particular challenge in the environment. So it means that they are fit to the environment to survive. And those organisms that don't have the variation or inherited traits that will make them to survive in that environment, they are considered unfit and they will die. They will be eliminated. So the more variation of types of species in an habitat, the more likely at least some will survive. So it means that more variation of a types of species in an habitat is important. So the more likely at least some of those types of species that are found in the environment will survive. So it means that it will be very difficult if you have an environment where we have, let's say, thousands of species. So when there is any problem, then some will survive and some will die. And another example is, look at the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs survived on Earth about 350 million years ago. But now there is no dinosaurs on Earth. And that means that because at that time, actually, dinosaurs survive on Earth because they are fit to survive in the environment. But later on, because the environment will not support them, they are all eliminated, and now they are replaced by mammals. So which community has a greater chance of surviving a natural disaster? So you see, look at community A and look at the community B. So if you look community A, the number of species in community A are far, far greater than that of organisms in community B. So it means that the community that will have high chances for surviving a natural disaster is community A, because there are so many species there. So more number of species in a particular environment, more chances that some of the organisms will survive. Look at it in the community A, there are snakes, flies. Look at so many other organisms in community A. So there is a likelihood that if there is any disaster, some of the organisms, when there is any disaster, some of the organisms will consider the environment unfit for them, so they will die, and some will survive. So the more the number of organisms in the environment, the more likelihood that some of the organisms will survive. So the competition. What is competition? So you see, whenever we set a competition, it means that there are more number of competitors, but limited resources. Let me just give another example. Currently, there is a problem of fuel. So because the individuals or the people that need that petrol are many, but the resources, which is the petrol, is very small, it's scarce. So as a result of that, there will be competition. And that is why we always follow queue. But if the resources is enough, if there is a sufficient resources, there will not be competition. Like for example, you cannot compare the competition of applying ABU Zaria in 5-6 years compared to last 2 years. The reason is because in the last 5-10 years, the number of universities in Nigeria are very small. But now there are so many universities. In Kaduna, in Kaduna states, like in Kaduna states, there are more than 8 universities. And when we move to Kano, there are also around 9 universities. So there are many. So it means that the universities are not limited. So that is why the competition will be low. So the competition of admission in ABU is now low compared to 5 and 10 years back. Why? Because the universities are many and they are now everywhere. So that is competition. So individuals compete for limited resources. So for example, an individual can compete for food, we can compete for water, organisms can compete for space, and they can also compete for mates. Assuming now some people, okay, now let me give you another example. In the previous years, men are competing for beautiful ladies, tall ones, and slim ones. But nowadays, because there are so many beautiful ladies, it's now because actually I can vividly remember like around 15 to 10 to 20 years back, a one single lady in a day, a one single lady can have more than 10 men to visit her at the same time. So she will start with one. After she give him like 2-3 minutes, then she will move to B. After she's done with that, she will also move to another one. So she will spend more time to the person she loves. But nowadays, because at that time there is a limited resources, and that is why there is competition. But now currently, with the current situation, some ladies or some women are even battling to get one. So it means that there is no competition. So a competition always comes when there is a limited resources. So natural selection occurs through survival of the fittest. When we said fittest, is the ability to survive and reproduce. It's the ability to survive and reproduce. So that is why we call natural selection as the survival of the fittest. So some organisms will have the ability to survive and reproduce in a particular environment, and some not. So not all individuals survive to adulthood. Of course, if there is a competition, it's not every living organisms that will actually reach or will survive to adulthood. Because as a result of that competition, some will compete for water, some will compete for food. So as a result of that competition, so those organisms that are higher and stronger in that particular environment will kill or will be the one to benefit from the limited resources. And those that are not strong will not benefit from that. So as a result of that, those organisms that are not stronger in the environment, then they will die. And that is what we call competition and then selection. So the individual with the best traits, adaptation, will survive and have the opportunity to pass on its traits to offspring. So it means that when we say selection, it means that when there are organisms that have best traits that make them to survive in a particular environment, so they will have an opportunity to pass that trait to their young ones. It means that their young ones will be in a better position to survive in that particular environment because they have all the traits that it takes for them to survive, sometimes with even some modification. So natural selection acts on the phenotype, that is physical appearance, not genotype. That's genetic makeup. So natural selection acts on the phenotype. It's usually on phenotype. That is when there is a natural selection, then you can see that clearly the organism that fits and survives in that particular environment is as a result of some phenotypic character that shows by that organism, not genotypic. Because when you say genotypic, it means that it's a genetic makeup. And it's usually inside, you can't see that. But phenotype is what you can see physically. So when a predator finds it is prey, it is due to the prey's physical characteristics, which can be color, slow speeds, not the alleles. So you see, what makes the predator find the prey is because of the color of the prey, or maybe any other physical characteristics, and that what make it to be identified. Let me tell you now, currently there are some organisms, because they want to survive in the environment, and they develop a lot of phenotypic characters that make them to suit the environment. Like there are some organisms, like generally, there are some kinds of organisms that naturally maybe they are surviving in a particular tree, and the tree is black, but they are red in color. So it means that if those insects are needed by some organisms like hens, so they can be easily identified on that tree. So they can just actually, based on their color, they will be identified, and then the predator will just kill them and take them out. But now currently these organisms are now wise enough. They now start developing, if they are surviving on a red tree, then they will also tend to change their color to be red, so that at least the color of the tree and that of the prey will now be the same. So that it will now be very difficult for the predator to identify them. So this is actually another surviving strategy by other organisms. And another thing, snakes some million years ago, they don't have venom. But because they are easily attacked by predators, and those snakes they doesn't have anything they would use or they can use to protect themselves, then they now develop venom, some proteins on their venoms, for them to be using it to retaliate attack by the predators. So individuals with traits that are not well suited to their environment will either die or leave few offspring. So evolution occurs when good traits build up in a population over many generations, and bad traits are eliminated by the death of the individuals. So now, let's look at the peppered moth. Which moth will the bat catch? Okay. So now, look at it. Look at A and B. So ladies and gentlemen, if you can now see clearly look at the A here. If you look at the environment here, which one actually appears as oat? This, because the moth can easily, the bat can easily identify this moth here. So the process in which the moth or some organisms come a pluck to suit the color with the environment, it used to be very difficult to be identified. So now look at this bat. Look at also picture B. You see this one is another moth, but it's actually the color of the moth is the same with that of the tree. So it means that this one can easily be identified and chopped up by these organisms. So now, descent with modification. Descent with modification. So descent with modification, each living species has descended with changes from other species over time. So it means that each living organisms on Earth is descendant or came from their original ancestor, but with some modification. And those modifications is important for them to survive in the environment. So therefore, all living organisms are descended from another organisms with a slight modification that will make them to suit the survival in a particular environment. And then the common descent. all living organisms are related to one another. So all living organisms are related to one another. So that is why now if you take human DNA and you now take the DNA from chicken and you now take the DNA from all other organisms, they are all made up of the same nucleotides. Adenine, guanine, uracil, and thymine. We are all made from that. But there are some slight changes and differences in terms of the arrangement and the number of these nucleotides. And that is what makes us differ from one another. But we are all related. We are all related. Remember, I told you the first organisms, first, the earth itself was created around 4.5 to 5 billion years ago. The earth was created around 4.5 to 5.0 billion years ago. And then the first organisms, which is prokaryotic cell, exists on earth around 3.9 billion years ago. So it's from these prokaryotic organisms, these prokaryotic organisms that all other organisms are us. All other organisms come from, but at different time. All other organisms came from. Remember, I told you last time that currently the living organisms on Earth are around 1.7 to 1.8 millions species. We have around this, but about 4.7 billion species. 4.7 billion species of organisms are now extinct because the environment don't longer need them. So they are now eliminated. So the importance of this is to understand that all living organisms came from the same ancestor, which is these prokaryotic organisms. Okay? So you see, this is actually the descent. You see, this is the origin, started from here. But if you look at it clearly, you can see that from these organisms, first, we have shark. And then we have tuna. We have frog. We have, we have human, whale, we have crocodile. So you see, they are all come from one single ancestor. But you see, the time shark came differ from the time tuna come. So this is like a time period. This is like a time. Okay. So this is like a time from here. It is like a time. So as time goes on, this will emerge, then another time this will emerge, but from the same descent, from the same ancestor. So all living organisms came from the same ancestor, but at different time. So evidence for evolution. Evidence for evolution. So ladies and gentlemen, we are going to rejoin again. Let's rejoin again.